Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, April 1st. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, we're taking a closer look at what federal spending actually delivers and not just what it costs. U.S. Strategic Command has awarded a $500 million IDIQ contract to accelerate delivery of warfighter-ready solutions as defense needs evolve. Plus, as uncertainty clouds federal research budgets, a new analysis shows how NIH funding ripples through state and local economies nationwide. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. More shakeup at the Treasury Department. The department is preparing for targeted layoffs at an office focused on monitoring the stability of the U.S. financial system. And over at the IRS, its IT shop is back in hiring mode. This comes after it permanently reassigned more than 1,200 IT employees to other parts of the agency. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman is here with more details. Jory, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Terry. Great to be here.
Seems like there's a lot of moving personnel pieces at the Treasury Department. Let's start with those layoffs. Who is going to be affected by that?
So this is coming down to the Office of Financial Research. This is a office that was created by Congress in the aftermath of the 2008 recession under the Dodd-Frank legislation to avoid similar economic crises from happening in the first place. They basically provide the data and keep an eye on the economic situation, look at key economic indicators to make sure that things are going well, and if there are red flags, trying to turn the ship back around. Now, this is an agency, this is an office that has been used to reductions. This was an office that saw about nearly half of its workforce cut under the first Trump administration, and it gradually built back up with its personnel. But now, once again, we're seeing this office go through some pretty major reductions. It's about a 60% cut. These are RIF notices that are expected to go out no later than mid-May. And there are some steps being taken here. Treasury is advising employees in this office to consider enrolling in a career transition assistance plan, basically that allows employees who are at risk of RIF notices to apply at other positions, open positions within Treasury at or below their current GS level, and also a reemployment priority list, which if they do get RIF'd and there are positions that open back up, they would be given priority consideration to fill those positions.
Jory, what's the logic behind this layoff?
This is an office that has been criticized not just from the Trump administration. There have been Republican lawmakers who have also been really trying to chip away at this office. An early version of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act last year would have eliminated this office. That provision never made it through to the final bill. Senator Ted Cruz has in recent years introduced legislation that would eliminate this office. The argument is basically that there are other offices, other employees within the Treasury Department that already monitor the economic health of the U.S. financial system, and that they don't need a designated office to do that work. So they say that they are overall redundant headcount for the Treasury Department.
And how many people then would be affected by these staffing cuts?
So what we've seen from the Trump administration in their budget proposal last year, they plan to cut staffing at the Office of Financial Research from nearly 200 full-time employees down to about 72.
And how does this connect to what's happening at the IRS?
As the Treasury Department is looking to reduce its headcount in this office, the IRS is in the business of hiring. They're back in hiring mode for some IT personnel. At a IRS all-hands meeting last month for its IT shop, the chief information officer said that he plans to hire up to 175 technical employees, and this is to fill critical staffing gaps in cloud, data, AI, and infrastructure to support strategic initiatives at the IRS.
And why is that happening now? They just went through a big reduction in their IT shop.
They did, and perhaps one leads to the other, right? Because we saw late last year in December, the IRS moved nearly 1,200 employees out of IRS IT. They were temporarily reassigned to report to the chief operating officer, although the agency acknowledged that was a temporary reorganization. They were going to find other work for these employees to do, but they repeatedly stressed that that work was no longer going to be IT or technology related. Many of them, although not all of them, got 120-day details to work in taxpayer services, handle some of the frontline work for the filing season, assisting other people in taxpayer services, answer calls, process incoming tax returns, things of that nature. But for the long term, none of these employees have really been given much of an indication of what work they'll be doing beyond those 120 days or really in the long term at all.
Is the IRS saying anything about how well that reassignment is working?
The IRS has not really addressed that all too well, but on one critical piece of things, the IRS is really getting some concern from Capitol Hill, and that is the issuing of electronic refunds to people who typically don't receive them that way. There are now at this point nearly 1.5 million taxpayers who have gotten notices from the IRS saying, hey, you didn't send your banking information to us for direct deposit, and as a result, you may have to wait 10 weeks to receive a paper check from the agency. This is all because of an executive order last year where the Trump administration tried to wean all of the federal government off of paper checks, which they say are more prone to fraud and improper payments, to electronic payments. That's all well and good. The Treasury Department has gotten up into the high 90 percentile of those payments being electronic in nature. It really is those final 6-7% or so that are the sticking point here. But these are people who largely are used to receiving paper checks from the IRS, and they may be unbanked individuals who just don't have that information to give.
And if they don't ever provide that information, what is the IRS solution?
The IRS is really going to exhaust all of its options to make sure that everyone who is able to get this payment electronically does get it electronically.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for keeping us up to date on all of these changes.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, as uncertainty clouds federal research budgets, a new analysis shows how NIH funding ripples through state and local economies nationwide. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. NIH funding touches far more than major research institutions. A new analysis maps how those dollars support jobs and businesses nationwide. United for Medical Research's latest report breaks down the geographic reach of that impact and why timing matters as budgets tighten. Joining us to walk through the findings is Caitlin Leach, president of United for Medical Research. Caitlin, it is great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Terry. Nice to be here.
United for Medical Research has just released its 2026 update on the economic impact of NIH funding, National Institutes for Health. And it opens with what I find a pretty stunning statistic, a 250% return on every dollar of NIH-funded research. Start at the top and walk us through that multiplier effect.
Absolutely. So our report shows that NIH research doesn't just drive medical breakthroughs, it's also a driver of our economy all across the country. So the $36.5 billion awarded to NIH-funded researchers in fiscal year 25 supported more than 390,000 jobs and generated more than $94 billion in new economic activity nationwide. So that's that 250% return on investment. For every dollar NIH spends, our economy generates about $2.57.
You've been watching this for a while. Is that a fairly consistent number? Does it surprise you?
It is relatively consistent. There is some variation every year, but we do see that NIH is a consistent economic driver. When Congress appropriates money to NIH and that money gets out to grantees all across the country who are investigating really interesting ideas to improve health across lots of diseases. As long as the money is spent, we're seeing that economic benefit.
I think a lot of people think about NIH as a place for scientific discovery, but not necessarily how that discovery gets made. So talk us through that. From $1 in a NIH research grant, where does it go? What kind of jobs get created? What generates that economic impact?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say the scientific advancements are a really important outcome in and of themselves of the research. And in some ways, other analyses have shown that the investment in NIH actually does save money in healthcare costs in the long term. But what we're talking about are the direct jobs that an NIH grant supports, maybe at a university or another research institution, and then the indirect jobs and economic benefits that happen as a result. So a research lab might buy equipment or tools that they use to enable their research. So the jobs both in the lab and then the jobs of the research enabling companies and tools and the manufacturing of all those products are all indirect jobs that are created because of NIH research. And then we also see the economic multiplier from all of those jobs and all the purchases of research goods and related services have a ripple effect in economies. So as people are paid, they're spending their money in their communities, maybe making purchases and dining out and other things. So the economic activity is also from that full life cycle of a dollar as it moves through our economy.
One of the striking findings in the report is how widely NIH funding is distributed across the states and communities. How does that geographic spread change the way policymakers might think about the investments in NIH?
It's really important and it's everywhere. So our report illustrates that there aren't just economic benefits in the places you might think, maybe Massachusetts or California, large states with research enterprises that are really well known. We see the benefits everywhere. So states like Alabama and Maine and West Virginia have that same economic impact, and it ripples maybe even as a greater impact in these states. So every member of Congress and our policymakers should care that NIH is strongly funded and consistently funded, because that money creates immediate jobs and economic impact. It also brings research to every state. So clinical trials are reaching constituents everywhere, and it's growing states' biomedical research capacity in places where that already exists, but also in places where that is emerging. So we think it's a really good investment everywhere, and we hope that policymakers see this information and understand the economic benefits for their communities.
I'm speaking with Caitlin Leach. She's president for United for Medical Research. Caitlin, you said that this multiplier effect has been fairly consistent for years, but 2025 was a tough funding year for NIH. You know, they were in the headlines a lot. There were a lot of grant programs that were interrupted or stopped permanently. Talk us through how all of that disruption in 2025 impacted the medical research community.
Absolutely. So the top line from our report is that because NIH's budget was fully spent, despite the fact that it was spent maybe slower throughout the fiscal year than a normal year, because all of NIH's budget was spent, we saw about the same economic impact overall that we might see in a previous economic impact report. However, as you say, there was a lot of uncertainty. And so that does have an impact, maybe not at the end of the day in the dollars and in our economic multiplier, but the uncertainty itself makes it difficult for grant recipients and the institutions they work for to plan, to maintain their staffing levels, to make research-related purchases. So the impacts are real. And luckily, because bipartisan support from members of Congress across the House and the Senate and both parties really ensured that there were not major cuts to NIH, and that in fact, the budget grew last year, was really important to sort of righting the ship during what was a very tumultuous time. So we're optimistic that what this report shows is that NIH can weather the storm as long as the funding increases are there and the grants are made to recipients and the dollars are getting out the door.
The report makes a really interesting point that I would love a little bit more clarity on. Multi-year funding. Typically, I think of that as a good thing. In a Department of Defense program where you have multi-year funding, it means that there's predictability to the program. The funding is going to be there for a long time. And folks like that because it adds some consistency. You make the point, though, that multi-year funding in NIH is not always a good thing. So tell us why that is different.
Yes, and it's a good point. There are times when a multi-year award is the right award for the type of project or for the investigator. And NIH has used multi-year awards at varying levels over the years. What we saw last year was because of the funding delays you mentioned, so it was a slow start to the fiscal year, and then by the end of the year, a lot of money went out the door very quickly. Awards themselves had to be larger, and so we saw an increased use of multi-year awards. So the proportion of the NIH budget that went to multi-year awards increased last year compared to previous years. And what that means in biomedical research, because of the way awards are typically funded, fewer awards went out the door. And so that means a lot of researchers were not funded, a lot of great ideas sit on the shelf. And for our economic analysis, likely if the money's not getting out into the economy, we're not going to see as great of the multiplier effect. So we're really watching closely to see the trends on multi-year awards going forward.
And in the biomedical space, does that also mean that you've committed funding to known projects, but you've sort of closed the innovation window? Perhaps amazing things might pop up 3 years from now, but you've already committed your funds.
Possibly, yes. We've heard arguments on both sides that it can be both stabilizing and more nimble, but I think you could argue either way. And I think that your point is absolutely right, that we do worry about all the amazing ideas that are submitted from researchers all across the country that are not funded.
As you look ahead then with this report, out the door, what are you hoping to see from legislators, from the leadership at NIH, maybe even from the research community in the future?
It's certainly my hope that NIH continues to have strong bipartisan support because disease knows no bounds. It doesn't know where you live or who you voted for. So we're really hopeful that members of Congress and agency leaders continue to steer the ship with strong funding to support the really exciting ideas that researchers have and to maintain the U.S.'s biomedical leadership all around the world. So it's a really important time, and we encourage continued strong investment in NIH.
I've been speaking with Caitlin Leach. She's president of United for Medical Research. Caitlin, thanks so much for joining me and for sharing this report with us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, during COVID, SBA moved fast to deliver disaster loans, but GAO says limited access to IRS tax data made oversight harder and increased program risk. But first, U.S. Strategic Command has awarded a $500 million IDIQ contract to accelerate delivery of warfighter-ready solutions as defense needs evolve. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. U.S. Strategic Command has awarded a $500 million IDIQ contract to the University of Nebraska's National Strategic Research Institute to support warfighter-ready solutions. The award is structured to emphasize speed, flexibility, and direct operational relevance, rather than one-off research projects. Joining me to talk through how these funds will advance STRATCOM's mission is the director of NSRI, Rick Evans. General Evans, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, thank you, Terry. Glad to be with you.
The National Strategic Research Institute that you head out there in Nebraska has just been awarded a $500 million IDIQ contract from STRATCOM to accelerate warfighter-ready solutions. Before we get into what those might be, just tell us a little bit about NSRI and what you do.
Yeah, that's great. So NSRI is one of 15 Department of War sponsored University Affiliated Research Centers, or UARCs for short. We happen to be sponsored on the department side by U.S. Strategic Command, and then our affiliated university is the University of Nebraska system. So that's why we're here in Nebraska. And with each one of these UARCs is unique. They have a unique set of mission parameters that they focus on. We call core competencies. And so ultimately, though, each of these UARCs is empowered to deliver solutions for the warfighter. To do it quickly, that's why they have them under contract. And as I often tell people, since I have a son who's in the military, the goal is to give the warfighter an advantage if we send them to do our nation's work and to bring them home safely to their families. So that's ultimately why we exist. And the goal is to produce those solutions that are important to the nation.
$500 million is a lot of money, and an indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract is super flexible. So you got a lot of money and a lot of flexibility. Why is that flexibility so important right now? What are the threats and how are they evolving?
Yeah, so let me start out with just the contract itself. So 500 million sounds like a big number, and it is a big number. I look at it as an opportunity because it's not necessarily guaranteed, but what it does do is give us a bathtub, if you will, that is filled up with individual pieces of work for various sponsors across the Department of War and even outside the department into other agencies and departments within the U.S. government, ultimately focused on making positive contributions to national security. And we know today's environment, those that are familiar with the national security strategy, the national defense strategy that have been recently released, know that we have a pretty dynamic environment around the world. We're seeing that actually play out in Central Command right now, but certainly with a couple nuclear near-peer adversaries, staying ahead of those growing and diversifying threats is a challenge for the nation. And so when you think about a contract vehicle like that, really what it's designed to do is to allow the department to stay ahead in the innovation sphere and deliver things and capabilities to the nation that allow us to hopefully be ahead of those threats before they actually become a problem for us. So that's really the design for a contract and how it ties into supporting our mission. And probably the key thing to remind people about UARCs is, there are lots of defense contractors and others out there that can do this type of work. We don't compete with them and we're not allowed to compete with them. But what we are in place for and have a contract is to operate at high speed. And to innovate and to tie the academic research capabilities that exist within a university like the University of Nebraska to those requirements that can't be met by national labs and other resources across the department. So that's our role as a UARC in linking the capabilities in academia to the department's warfighting requirements.
You highlight the need for speed right there. And NSRI has worked with STRATCOM for a long time. You have a very comfortable, habitual working relationship. How does that habitual relationship help you respond with speed to their demands?
Yeah, so we've been around since 2012 as a UARC, so we're actually one of the younger UARCs. A lot of them have been really doing this type of work since even World War II. But STRATCOM is a little bit unique. My military background is my last 7 years were on the staff at U.S. Strategic Command. So that's one of the reasons why I'm in the position, so that we have an opportunity to understand their requirements and to translate what can be confusing military lingo and acronyms to academia and make it easy for people to understand and hopefully focus on those products that we can deliver back to the department. Now, STRATCOM is a little bit unique, being a combatant command. So one of the 11 combatant commands. Most people in the audience will probably know that combatant commands focus on warfighting, not necessarily research and development. And so that gives us a little bit of a unique relationship. And STRATCOM, of course, has some very important missions. So if you think about deterring strategic attack is typically job one for our nation. And so STRATCOM performs that mission, and we certainly support that along with nuclear operations. A growing area of work is electromagnetic spectrum, or what we call joint electromagnetic spectrum operations, or GEMSO for short. But think about it as dominating the electromagnetic spectrum is almost as important as air superiority, ground superiority, maritime superiority in today's fight. And so understanding those requirements requires us to be embedded with them, to understand what their needs are, and to hopefully stay ahead of those needs so that we can deliver solutions. And that's that unique UARC relationship where we actually have some NSRI employees working at STRATCOM every single day. I have an office down there. I was just down there last week. I'll be down there on Thursday again to meet with commanders and staff members to continuously dialogue on what their needs might be and how we're going to position ourselves to be an asset to them. So that relationship between the sponsor and the UARC is really the key to a successful relationship as a UARC. And that's really the reason UARCs exist, is to have that special relationship. And that's why we're not allowed to compete with industry, because we have unique access to the government in terms of performing our mission.
I'm speaking with Rick Evans. He's the executive director of the National Strategic Research Institute. So let's follow up on that a minute, because NSRI emphasizes moving from concept to capability. You don't just produce studies, you don't just write reports, but what does it take to ensure that the research projects you do work on are actually usable by operators and decision makers?
Yeah, so the UARC world is a little bit different than the typical university doing research. Typically, we are doing cost reimbursable contracts that require constant interaction with our government partners to make sure we're delivering progress towards the end state. And that's measured really almost monthly, as opposed to typical research grant at a university, which might be, we're going to pay you X amount of money to 2 years from now deliver a paper, a product, or idea, or whatever it is. Typically, we are focused on, really continuing progress that's measured by the government every single month towards that outcome of the deliverable capability that they need. So that's really what separates us from the typical university that you have out there. And we do deal with, developing prototypes and other things that are hardware, if you will. We also do studies and analysis. And, one of the interesting things we do is oftentimes we're handed somebody else's product and asked to be a neutral broker in evaluating whether or not that actually delivers the capability that the government asked that other company to do. So that's called independent verification of that capability. So we play kind of a niche role there, really the full spectrum of developing hardware all the way to looking at other people's hardware and everything in between.
Well, let's get back then to where we started, this new $500 million contract. What will that enable you and NSRI to plan for over the next 10 years?
Yeah, really, from my perspective as the executive director, the important thing that this contract brings, in addition to the opportunity that I mentioned earlier, Terry, is that it's a testament to the confidence we've built in our capabilities up until now. This is our fourth IDIQ contract with Stratcom. Each one of the UARCs goes through a review every 5 years before these contracts can be awarded. So it's a full evaluation of two things. Does the Department of War still need the capabilities that this UARC has assigned to it? And they're not supposed to be duplicated between other UARCs, number one. And number two, if they do need that requirement, are they delivering results that are impactful, so that we want to continue the relationship? And so this is a revalidation of what we've been doing and the impact that we've had and the confidence that the government has in us to deliver those solutions going forward. And the contract itself certainly enables those individual projects that will fall underneath it. But ultimately, it is the outcome that's important, and continuing that relationship to know the requirements as quickly as possible, to build the capability and capacity to deliver, and then to do it on time, on target, really is our focus as we look at the opportunities brought by this new contract.
Do you see opportunities to build even tighter relationships between government, academia, and the operators? Is that relationship working well right now?
Yeah, it is. And, I mentioned the unique factor of a combatant command sponsoring a UARC. Combatant command, especially U.S. Strategic Command, I would consider myself, when I was in uniform there, to be a nuclear operator, a deterrence practitioner, if you will. And so that's who we're working with every single day, are truly the operators at U.S. Strategic Command. And then when you think about the academia side of this, we know there's a lot of really smart professors. There's a lot of students that are interested in getting into national security work. And when we think about it from the Department of War perspective, they are very interested in how we're going to develop the workforce of the future to support the broad needs across national security, especially in the Department of War and a unique place like Stratcom. And so bringing some student programs into this, ties to academia, offering faculty the opportunity to expand their research, out of what might just be a typical National Science Foundation or National Institutes of Health grant, really offers great opportunity and attracts elite faculty to the University of Nebraska and the other universities affiliated with these UARCs, because it's a unique opportunity that's not normally available outside of the defense contractor world.
I've been speaking with Rick Evans. He's the Executive Director of the National Strategic Research Institute. Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm glad to be here and join the conversation.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, during COVID, SBA moved fast to deliver disaster loans, but GAO says limited access to IRS tax data made oversight harder and increased program risk. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. When disaster loan programs scale up quickly, data sharing becomes critical. GAO says outdated systems and manual consent requirements limited SBA's access to IRS tax data during COVID, leaving oversight gaps even as billions went out the door. Joining me to break down why that matters and where progress has been made is Director for Financial Markets and Community Investments at GAO, Courtney LaFountain. Ms. LaFountain, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
We're going to talk about a new report from GAO that looks at how the Small Business Administration and the IRS shared tax data during the COVID-19 disaster loan programs. Before we do that, at the highest level, why did GAO take a look at this and what were the big findings?
So we looked at how SBA and IRS shared data for two SBA programs. One is the ongoing disaster loan program. This is a program that offers loans to businesses, nonprofits, homeowners, and renters after a natural disaster, like a big hurricane. These are loans that help with property damage and also to help small businesses with expenses like payroll and rent. And SBA uses tax data in the application process to verify applicant identities, check that they meet eligibility criteria, and assess ability to repay the loan. So we also looked at a related program that Congress created specifically to help small businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this program was built based on the ongoing disaster loan program. There were a few differences, but it still aimed to help small businesses with expenses like payrolls and rent so they could make it through the economic effects of the pandemic. And this program isn't accepting new applications anymore. But during the pandemic, SBA used tax data to verify applicants' identities and again, check that they met eligibility criteria for the loan. So we looked at data sharing for these two programs, and we found that SBA and IRS generally follow several leading practices, and they're getting a lot of things right. They have tools that allow them to quickly reach agreements on key decisions. Their agreements include practices to ensure that tax data are trustworthy and are well protected. And they're two agencies working together, so they have established compatible policies. They've got roles and responsibilities, a kind of a regular cadence for updating their agreements. So lots of things are going well. However, their data sharing process has a couple of weak spots because it's not fully automated, and those steps can create bottlenecks. And, they both agree that a fully automated process would be more efficient, but they've got different views on how to get there, and that's they haven't made as much progress on that as they could.
Well, let's back up a minute because the report says that nearly half of the approved disaster loans didn't have verified tax data in their application records. You talked about them making improvements and doing more data sharing, but I think it's pretty interesting that at the beginning of the COVID disaster relief law, Congress expressly prohibited that SBA could not collect tax data. Talk about why that would be written into a law and what impact that has on potential fraud detection for them.
That's a great point. So, right, the fact that almost half of the approved applications we looked at didn't have some kind of tax-related document from IRS is largely a result of how that program was designed. Tax data weren't part of the application process until April 2021, and that's over a year after Congress created the program in March 2020. Tax data wasn't part of the application process because Congress wanted loans to go out to borrowers more quickly. So when they set up the COVID-19 loan program, they allowed SBA to approve applications based on kind of a minimal amount of information, credit scores, and some self-reported information, and really restricted SBA's ability to use tax data the way it had been using it in the other program. So loans got out the door more quickly, but they really limited SBA's ability to ensure that the loans were going to eligible borrowers instead of, fraudsters or other people who didn't qualify. Once they removed this restriction, of course, SBA said that it made it a lot easier for them to ensure that program integrity.
SBA still can't access IRS tax data without borrower consent, right? And that consent is still processed manually. Is that part of what's creating some of the data disconnects?
It is worth noting here that taxpayers provide a lot of data and information about ourselves through our federal tax returns, where we live, how much money we make, Social Security numbers, business ID numbers. And it's because of all this that tax data are protected and confidential. And so that's why IRS requires taxpayers to provide consent before their tax data can be shared with another agency. There's a limited number of exceptions there that require specific authorization from Congress. But anyway, so it's not necessarily that consent itself is an issue, but the fact that SBA and IRS are using a manual approach to verify consent. So it's kind of those two ingredients together that can create issues.
I'm speaking with Courtney LaFountain. She's Director for Financial Markets and Community Investments at GAO. Let's talk about that disconnect there when SBA is seeking consent and there's manual processing involved and IRS sends over data. What sort of problems does that induce into the system, both for accuracy and for detecting fraud?
So where these manual steps really become an issue is when the volume of loan applications increases a lot relative to the staff available to work the process. This is something we saw during the COVID-19 loan program, especially on the IRS side. They faced some challenges having enough staff to work the process and also allocating work to the right processing centers. And what this all meant for borrowers is that it was taking a lot longer to get their loans. SBA tried using some workarounds, like asking applicants to provide tax returns themselves, but this had its own challenges. The Inspector General reported that SBA was still approving some loans without having the tax return data to help verify information, and some of the loans still went to ineligible applicants. And so this workaround wasn't fully effective.
GAO has made some recommendations to improve the process, including some potential statutory changes and technical upgrades. Walk us through those recommendations and maybe which ones might be at the top of the list.
So again, when we looked at how SBA and IRS share data, we did find that they're getting a lot of things right. Like I said, though, the data sharing process isn't fully automated and has those manual review steps. So that means there's some opportunities to improve efficiency. Our recommendation is for SBA to take some kind of step to improve efficiency, but we, typically defer to agencies on exactly how to implement our recommendations, and that's what we would do in this case as well. One option is for SBA to pursue legal authority to obtain tax data directly from IRS without first obtaining taxpayer consent. And this is an option that would require Congress to act and amend the Internal Revenue Code to give SBA that specific authority. If this happens, then those manual review steps where SBA and IRS are kind of checking that consent forms are signed and complete, those steps go away. However, SBA said it hasn't really pursued this authority because it's not broad or flexible enough. And, if you get the authority for one program, it doesn't necessarily apply to a future program. So SBA has some reservations. The other option is for SBA to adopt technologies that could make the data sharing process more efficient. And this is where they told us they're prioritizing their efforts. They didn't provide details on exactly what these technologies look like, but that's the route that they said that they prefer.
I've been speaking with Courtney LaFountain. She's Director for Financial Markets and Community Investment at GAO. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks. Great speaking with you.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. If you missed last week's DoD Modernization Exchange, don't worry. You can still catch the encore presentation this week. Register for Wednesday's sessions at federalnewsnetwork.com. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Up next, the top national headlines from CBS News and the Federal Newscast. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.
And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, April 1st. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, we're taking a closer look at what federal spending actually delivers and not just what it costs. U.S. Strategic Command has awarded a $500 million IDIQ contract to accelerate delivery of warfighter-ready solutions as defense needs evolve. Plus, as uncertainty clouds federal research budgets, a new analysis shows how NIH funding ripples through state and local economies nationwide. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Federal contractors have been required to comply with the Trump administration's mandate to remove anything that is considered diversity, equity, and inclusion for the past 15 months. But under President Donald Trump's new executive order, signed last week, vendors face harsher penalties that could include False Claims Act lawsuits as well as possible suspension and debarment. For more on why this new order goes further than previous efforts, Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller, joins me now. Jason, great to have you.
Always a pleasure, Terry.
What does this new EO require contractors to do?
The new EO outlines 6 new or expanded requirements for agencies and contractors, as well as 7 possible penalties for violations of that new order. Now, we'll get to the violations and penalties in a second. But really, what they're doing is saying, hey, anything that's diversity, equity, and inclusion related, they define that by any what they call disparate treatment based on race or ethnicity in the recruitment, employment, including hiring and promotions, contracting, including vendor agreements, program participation, or allocation or deployment of an entity's resources. They define it one step further to say program participation means participation in or access or admission to training, mentoring, leadership development programs, educational opportunities, clubs, associations, or similar opportunities. So they're really casting a very wide net of what it means to be a DEI program. As for what they're required to do, it really does span the gamut. And some of it is agency focused. So within, for instance, 30 days, the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council has to come up with a new clause that agencies would have to add to existing and new contracts to address these new requirements or DEI. When it comes to contractors, for instance, they would have to do other things such as submit information to the government to show that they are complying with the DEI order. What would that be? So that could be information from their books. It could be documents. It could be any sort of information that would kind of uphold them. Secondly, they have to flow this down to their subcontract level, which is very difficult, right? So they have to say, hey, subcontractors, are you doing any of this DEI stuff? And if you are, we need to know about it. And if you're not, you need to prove that you're not. This actually goes a lot further than a lot of the other ones, and I think that's why there's a growing concern about, okay, what does this really mean for us as contractors? But even just this idea of proving it, flowing it down to your subcontractors is going to be a lot of work.
Jason, that does sound like a big new burden, but how are these requirements actually different from the previous EO and other guidance around DEI?
What's interesting about this is this order is not necessarily new for a lot of the vendors, right? So if you go back over the last 15 months, when the Trump administration got into office, the president signed an EO back in January of 2025, ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity. That revoked several Biden administration orders, and then it also held contractors responsible for really taking specific actions and not allowing kind of workforce balancing and on certain things. So it really kind of moved it back. You saw the Justice Department issue guidance to clarify what DEI violations would be. They actually created a task force as well at the Justice Department to prosecute companies who violated certain civil rights laws. And then the Equal Opportunity Commission also issued guidance, so again, to take this even further as it's related to DEI in the workspace. So there's been a lot going on over the years. But I also heard from Jonathan Aroney, who's a lawyer with Shepherd Mullen. He was actually on the off-the-shelf program with Roger Waldron, and what he told Roger was this is one that makes clear that this is really important to the administration, so start working on it right away. Don't wait for the FAR clause to come out. Don't wait for an interim rule. Get on this quickly. But then he said that this is a level of disclosure that we haven't really seen in previous executive orders or guidance. Asking vendors to submit information, submit documentation is really a next level type of compliance issue. And I think that's really concerning because proving that, the cost of that, and we'll get into the penalties in a little bit, is really kind of a big deal. I also saw a blog post from the folks at Venable, and their lawyers wrote they call this a significant expansion of the administration's current approach to DEI, a greater increase of enforcement risk by facilitating through a contract clause the government's scrutiny of the contractor's DEI policies. So I think that while a lot of these requirements were there already, what this EO does is say, okay, well, not only will we be mad at you if you violate this, we're going to punish you if you don't kind of get rid of this DEI, what they determine as DEI type of efforts and behaviors.
It sounds like contractors should start working on this right away, even if they don't have the whole homework assignment. What can they do to ensure that they are complying with the EO and eventually those new acquisition regulations?
I think there's several things you can do to start. First of all, you have to kind of take inventory of what this is and what are you doing today, and does it meet the administration's, if you will, standards or requirements? Is it considered DEI or not? But more importantly, Aaron says you should really bring together an internal task force. Broaden the people that will come in. So you bring in the human resources, the legal, the compliance, the finance, all the contracts, help you reduce your risk by understanding and looking at this as a team. Don't just say, hey, you're the contracting officer or you are a program manager of our team, you take care of it. It really has to be a bigger and broader discussion because of how serious the risks are to contractors. And this also, there's a cost here. And I think the government may not quite understand what that cost is because you have to prove it. So that's a documentation. That documentation is not free. There's a cost to writing up the documentation, submitting the documentation. I'm sure there's a cost for lawyers who are going to be part of that discussion group. So I think that what a lot of contractors have to do is understand the clause, understand their inventory or what they're working on currently. Is it close to or does it violate any sort of requirements, and then start to take actions to get themselves in a better place. And again, time and really bringing the right people together to help understand how to move forward and reduce their risk.
Jason, you've mentioned penalties a couple of times in our discussion here. If an agency believes a vendor isn't in compliance with an EO, what are those penalties?
There are all kinds of penalties that's laid out in the EO. On the simple side, they could just have their contract canceled. They could be suspended from their contract until they decide whether or not you violated the EO. But then they go even harsher. They could file a False Claims Act lawsuit. If you say, oh, no, we're not DEI, we don't have any DEI processes, and you're found to have some, then you could be brought up on allegations and potential get fined for violating this executive order. Now, what's interesting about that, generally speaking, is, False Claims Acts usually there's civil and there's criminal. So this, I guess, would be considered a civil penalty versus a criminal penalty because executive orders aren't law. So therefore, you're not criminally negligent, but you are potentially violating a civil penalty. So that would be very interesting to see how the Justice Department handles that, and if a vendor takes the Justice Department to court to fight it, what would the court rule? Because again, an EO is really just a very strong policy. It's not the law of the land. Now, if the government really wants to really press their case, they also could recommend the vendor for suspension or debarment from contracting altogether. Now, that seems to be the harshest penalty, but at the same time, if they feel like we've told you you're violating it, you continue to violate it, you're fighting us in court, well, we'll just suspend you from doing any future government contracting. And again, that seems to really take this to the next level. And I think that's why a lot of the lawyers are saying, hey, this is why compliance and making sure you have a compliance team and a task force in place to understand is so important, because you don't want to have to, again, hire the lawyer to fight your battle in court or in arbitration in any way, because that then really becomes even more costly.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, thanks for bringing us the story.
My pleasure, Terry.
And you can find the full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, as uncertainty clouds federal research budgets, a new analysis shows how NIH funding ripples through state and local economies nationwide. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.